Welcome to Teach with Rodney. I've been reading through Genesis, and I actually been going through Abraham's story, starting from Genesis 11. And I noticed a few things. I think Lot's life is very interesting, and I think he's a cautionary tale, if you may, and I just think about this, right? Abraham, a man chosen by God, who God has intended for great and mighty things. Well, it clearly says in Genesis 12 that God will make Abraham a great nation and he will bless him, basically. And from him, a lot of people will be blessed. So such a promise means that there's a lot of things tied up in Abraham that the blessing is only going to come in connection with Abraham. Okay, so I believe that Lot being in that environment, knowing why Abraham was leaving the Chaldeans, that Abraham is not leaving just to leave, but there's a blessing that's tied up in him. And if I'm Lot, I'm like, okay, I need to be around this guy to stay blessed. I have to be around this guy for there to be a future, a hope, if you may. And I think that's part of why Lot left with him. Obviously Abraham was partly disobedient, but Lot still chose to go with him. And I thought that was a very good decision. He continues with him, he goes with him, from the Chaldeans. They end up in Haran, his dad dies, and then they continue on to Bethel, Ai area. They settle there, and so far God has been faithful to Abraham and Lot as well, because Lot and Abraham were both wealthy. And it says specifically in Genesis 13 that, when they came back, they left Egypt and they came back to Ai, Bethel area, I believe. And they basically were rich, right? And the riches was to the point where they couldn't live together, and well, they could, but I believe this is actually where Lot's first error occurred, because one, they grew rich. His riches is probably part of being around Abraham, God blessing him, and being in proximity. He probably got blessed also. So now I think this is where his first mistake came, because I think in the midst of the riches, in the midst of the comforts, right, when conflict came, he chose himself. Right? Because when the fight was happening, it wasn't between Abraham and Lot. It was between his herdsmen and the people who were looking after their stuff. So Abraham is like, hey, bro, we don't need to fight. Like, if you want, just basically go wherever you choose. But wherever you go, I'll go the opposite direction. So we don't fight. Right? Now, for me, in light of knowing that Abraham was about to be blessed, and well, this is speculation, obviously, but with Lot knowing that Abraham will be blessed, I think it would have been more wise of him to be like, nah, bro, I understand. Let me figure it out with my people so you and me can live peaceably, right? And from that, obviously, maybe for selfish reasons, even, he would have been blessed as well. But I think he probably got a little bit proud, comfortable, having everything he needed. And in a sense, he probably felt like he didn't need Abraham. And I think that is evident in his next actions, because now being rich, being comfortable, now where's the nicest place I can go live? Where's the nicest place that, I'm going to enjoy this the most, right? And obviously there's no text specifically to explore this, but I'm just making an assumption from how Lot's decision came to be. He looked at Sodom and Gomorrah and was like, man, this city is really nice. There's a lot of water, there are a lot of plains. And I was like, all right, cool, I'm going to go live over here. Now this is the first time we see Lot outside of, quote unquote, the covering of Abraham. And in that step, in moving away, right? And I just want to highlight a little bit of a point here, that covenant protects, it preserves, it keeps you, right? Because God is faithful to what he has said, and he's faithful to establish what he has said. So now making the promise to Abraham means that Abraham essentially could not die. He had to live until what God had intended will come to pass. And God, being faithful, will do everything in his power to preserve his life. Right now, Lot by proxy may very well would have been preserved as well. But when he chose to go away, a lot of things happened. One, he went to a place that seemed good in his eyes, and he went to live there. But the moment he stepped away from Abraham, now here's the thing that we often as individuals kind of do. We kind of make decisions on how things seem, but God, being outside of time, always knows what's to come. So Lot choosing his way was, in a sense, stepping away from what was tied to Abraham. So he chose his own way. And once he chose his own way, he stepped away from that. He's basically walking in the dark now. He didn't know what's ahead. And living in Sodom and Gomorrah, well, what do you know? In verse chapter 14 or 15, I believe, there's a war between 5 kings that he had nothing to do, things that he didn't know about. And what do you know? They capture him, they capture his family and all his goods. He basically loses everything. Now, for me, that rings a bell, right? Because now, if you believe that God is the one who's going to preserve you, right, then, I'm not going to make decisions on what I see. I'm going to make decisions because I believe that it's the will of God, and because God has said, he will kind of see it all come to an end. But anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here, but at the end of the day, he made the decision for himself. He gets captured, he loses everything, and he's basically in the enemy's camp. Now, Abraham catches wind of this, and he goes and rescues Lot, and he restores Lot. He restores his family. And interestingly, he gave him all of his wealth back. And I actually think that's interesting because now that he had all of his wealth, now it's kind of like what comfort does, right? He lost, I think for me, if I was in that moment and Abraham came to save me and gave me everything that I have with his own man, I think the safest place to be in the world would be with him. But what world does it make sense to go back to the very place that there was a battle, that the country got conquered and you taken captive? For me, that makes no sense to me. So he went back, he stayed there again. Instead of staying with Abraham, instead of being in quote unquote the light under the preservation of the covenant that was with Abraham, and went back to Sodom and Gomorrah. Why? I believe it was because everything was restored to him. And that comfort just blinded him in a sense, maybe even the providence of God, because he needed to establish a thing with Abraham. But at the end of the day, he continued to choose himself. He continued to choose comfort. He continued to choose the things that could make his life, quote unquote, better in the world that we can see. Now, yet again, he goes from light into darkness. And when you're in darkness, you never know what's ahead. Now, this is the unfortunate part. He went right back to it. And now this time, obviously God continued to show mercy on Lot on behalf of Abraham. But this time, he really lost everything and never got it back. But the unfortunate thing is he still never went back to Abraham because, maybe I should say, but the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, because the angels came, they go there, they drag Lot out of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he chooses a city where he wants to go. And actually, maybe I should pause here for a second, because when the angels grabbed him, they took him out of the city. And I think if I were Lot and angels told me they're about to destroy a place and they grab me and take me outside, I would probably ask them, what should I do? But he still decided to make the decision for himself, not regarding God still. And he was like, oh yeah, no, I don't want to be here, but this small city over here is somewhere in the mountain, and there my life will be preserved. Basically putting his destiny in his own hands and denying God the opportunity to protect him. Again, also being out of the covenant with Abraham. So now he winds up there. Sodom and Gomorrah gets destroyed. He goes up to live in Zoar. I think that's what it was called. And while living on the mountain, this is so sad because one, he lost his wife, he lost his wealth, and worse than that, he went to live by himself in some mountain, and now his wife, his daughters decide to get him drunk and have kids with your dad. Now for me, that's the epitome of darkness. That's the epitome of being outside of the will of God. Because in that one moment, he chose his way. Well, more than one moment, but in choosing his way, he just continued more and more and more into the dark. And it only got worse from there, because now these same kids who had kids with him now, they had the Moabites and Ben-Ami. But if you remember, the Moabites were part of the reasons why during the Exodus, the Israelites were plagued. They were basically, God was against them. They were tempting them. They caused them to sin, and they were in disfavor with God. You know, so like Lot's life just deteriorates from that point. You know, and in reading and just kind of looking at it from this perspective, I'm like, wow, you know, being with God is not an easy thing. And to walk on the straight and narrow is definitely not easy. However, whatever way I choose for myself, or whichever way I choose to go, is probably worse, but you don't know. You know, but you may be comfortable for a time, but there's the very real possibility that, you know, what's going to happen the next day may very well take everything from you. You know, so anyway, what's my point? I've been saying a lot here, right? Well, one, covenant preserves. Covenant preserves because it's God who is faithful. It is God who will protect and keep you until his covenants, his promises comes to pass. But the bigger picture, right? It says it in Proverbs. It says, you know, there's a way that seems right unto man, but leads to death, you know, but it leads to death. And in that same sense, you know, choosing God's way may not always, quote unquote, seem right. It may seem testy. It may seem more challenging. It may seem less comfortable. But at the end of it all, God is faithful and able to bring us to an expected end. So you're better off staying the course and trusting God to see you through than you are choosing your way and not knowing what destruction lies ahead. Thank you for joining me. God bless.